This is Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, a weekly series of podcasts about happiness and work culture. I've got someone who helps answer the question about whether work culture exists. Dr. Richard Claydon describes himself as a transdisciplinary behavioural scientist stroke ironist. Does company culture exist? Let's try and find out. Here's Dr. Richard Claydon. In the work that you talk about how we've celebrated strategy more over the last few years at the expense of culture. Do you just want to talk through your take on the history of these things?
So strategy has been around for much longer than culture. So strategy became the big thing in organizational thought in the 60s. And you had a bunch of different guys working on what strategy looked like then. You had all the military terms in organization appearing, where you have deadlines and milestones and targets, etc. Came out of this group of thought. It really became sort of dominant through the work of Michael Porter and the Five Forces and what I would call a deliberate strategy. He sort of came up in the 70s and the early 80s. And at the same time that Porter was becoming a major player, you had out of Japan, you had this worry in the States that Japan was becoming a competitor. So you sort of had the idea of there's a sort of the Japanese miracle, and how did Japan, within 30 years of the Second World War, become an economic power, the second biggest economy in the world, an economic powerhouse rivaling the States. And so culture got brought in as the final piece of the strategic jigsaw puzzle at that stage. It said, well, the employees are deeply, deeply loyal. They're deeply, deeply enthusiastic, deeply, deeply committed to the organization in a way that American employees they're more individualistic and resistant. They're not. They don't have that same level of loyalty. So one of the big ideas was strong culture. It took off in a massive way. So if you actually look at populist and academic stuff in the 80s, there's a massive outswelling of work on what the advantage of strong culture in organizations. You know, you get a strong culture in, and the big promise was you would get hardworking, enthusiastic and committed employees. And through that, you would then develop more and more products in a strategic sense, because they would be committed to these kind of processes. And
one of the things I saw in your work is you said that companies that try to create this single culture that exists across all the people who are working for them, they're trying to say that everyone should have the same personality characteristic. Your whole point is that's utterly implausible. It's not remotely realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. So every company has multiple cultures existing within the organization. There's three different ways of looking at it. One, you have the good culture. Everything that's not aligned to that is this amorphous, bad, appley mess. Another sort of negative way is you've never really created your culture at all. It's all fragmented and all kinds of stuff is going on. And nobody's really aligning to anything. And then sort of a middle ground is, well, you've got a defined core culture and you've got some quite defined subcultures. So at least you know how to get your communication working between these ones. You know how various different people are behaving. So that's sort of the suggestion is that it's impossible to deliver in the first place. It should work. You know, you have a culture, and out of that culture you get certain types and certain roles and certain activities.
Yeah. But
it's being turned on its head, and it's like, well, okay, if we hire people with certain personality types, that will then create the kind of culture that we want. They sort of try and get all these systems to try and get the right person and get the right fit. At a very, very cynical level, culture fit ends up hiring the wrong people or the best gamers. It doesn't really do enough in terms of let's get a pluralistic group of people who can contribute to the company in multiple ways, which I think is where the future of work is going.
Should companies try and move away from trying to have this monoculture? What would your advice be?
So in a deliberate strategy, you sort of have this single corporate strategy, single culture that's valid for, that everyone follows it. Now, in a complex world, and complex organizational environment, that's problematic. So a single corporate strategy we're going to suggest is valid for businesses that operate in an environment of certainty, where cause and effect can be easily determined, where customers' expectations are well known and stable, and when there's no probability of new competitors suddenly arising. But that's not very realistic. Just to do an analogy about what that might look like, if you look at the polar bears in the North Pole, absolutely perfectly adapted to survival, killing everything, top of their game, everything's brilliant, but they're not expecting the ice to suddenly melt from under their feet. They don't have a secondary practice to deal with melting ice. Organizations need to have these multiple strategies going on because they are existing in complex environments. So they can't dictate this top-down core strategy. They have to allow strategies to emerge. Winning strategies appear out of experimental ideas. So Henry Mintzberg's perfect example is you have the idea of IKEA and their flat pack furniture. Now that happened when an employee got frustrated. He had to take the legs off his chair or a table to transport it. He said, well, wouldn't it be a lot easier if we could constantly do this rather than have to... And they made a whole business out of it. Wow. Now, this was a young, this was a nobody employee who his idea went up the organization. You put your resources into things that work now. You experiment and you keep on pushing resources into these various experiments as and when they work. So the classic way of doing that is you eliminate waste. So you get rid of unproductive meetings, you get rid of poor project management, you try and stop spending so much time on reports, you try and reduce approval bottlenecks, you try and kill your legacy systems, you try and you try and get rid of inefficient processes. But actually to do it in the cultural sense, what you need to potentially fix then is what I would like to call behavioral waste rather than process waste. So the behavioral waste in a complex culture is you've got all these people spending lots of energy existing in these, in monocultures, trying to perform to the way the monoculture expects, where there are actually all kinds of other things going on. You get people who become cognitively confused. They don't know how to behave because they've got multiple systems telling them to behave a different way, or multiple managers telling them to behave different ways. You've got people who are emotionally exhausted. They're getting bullied and they're getting shouted at, and they're becoming very psychologically distressed because they're spending all of their energy in survival mode. And then you have the people who are the zealots, who have totally attached to a system or technology or a process that they've spent years and years working with, and it's suddenly being pulled out from under their feet, and they'll do anything they can to protect that because it's what's given them meaning, and they'll have all kinds of toxic behaviors to try and deal with that. For me, in lots of cultures, they're the three things that you've got to eliminate. You then have to look at, well, how do you do that? So we went back to Google's Project Aristotle, where they examined what made a perfect team. So 2 years, 180 teams, 37,000 employees. And they argued that the one key difference between a really great team and just an okay team was psychological safety. But to go back to Amy Edmonson's work, so I think that's the starting point. How do you solve it? And she talks about impression management. So she says the big problem in organizations is everyone's managing the impression that they give off to everybody else. So I just added weak to the front of that. There's a form of weak impression management that's dominant in lots of organizations. And she's very clear in what that means. She says you don't want to be ignorant, so you don't ask questions. You don't want to appear incompetent, so you don't admit mistakes. You don't want to appear intrusive, so you don't offer ideas. And you don't want to appear to be negative, so you don't question the status quo. So that's what you've got to eliminate, that kind of impression management. That's when you start creating a psychologically safe environment.
So effectively, what you seem to be saying is that building effective teams, absolutely something that can be a capability of a company, but the idea that those teams then aggregate up into this big monoculture is just nonsense.
And I would prefer, so I much prefer to think of it as a civilization. Think of the film Gladiator. I mean, the Russell Crowe character was a Spaniard leading the Roman legion, a completely different mindset, a completely different culture, coming in and doing good work because he was just the right kind of person for that kind of role. So if you've got a whole bunch of different teams with a whole bit different characteristics, rather than saying, well, we've got to put them all into this central culture, how do we get them to communicate well together? How do we get these subcultures to understand each other? So that when communication goes up and down the lines, and the new interpretation of what's going on in one subculture by the other, and there's huge value by having these new interpretations. So you get that communication working well, and you go, oh wow, I didn't think of it that way, and suddenly you're moving forward again.
All of the episodes are on the website, which is eatsleepworkrepeat.fm. I'm Bruce Daisley. See you next time.